You're listening to Weather with Enthusiasm. On Thursday, July 29th, 2021, the humidity was just unbelievable here in the Midwest, especially for the southern Illinois area. The reason why in Iowa the dew points were not that high on Thursday is because the temperatures were not that high. The front was already moving through. I don't know how to explain Omaha. Probably the front was dipping, had a more of a southward. It was the center of the front was probably moving more southeast than places in the western part of the front. So probably Omaha didn't get hit with the front as early as some of the places in Iowa got hit. That's one thing. Number two is that earlier this year, there have been a lot of floods in southern Illinois and places to the south. And the soil, the moisture in the soil is probably much higher in southern Illinois than it is in Iowa this year. Iowa is much closer to Minnesota. Minnesota has been under an exceptional drought for much of this year. In fact, even Iowa probably has drought conditions. I know northern Illinois has some drought conditions. So that could be an explanation for that. I wanted to go ahead and just explain something about dew point. Most people are not familiar with dew point. They don't know how to react. They don't know how to react. And what I mean by that is that when you open up a weather map and you see temperatures, people know when to say, wow. So, for example, if it's in the middle of winter and all of a sudden temperatures are in the 7th, let's say it's January 1st, and temperatures 80s for Illinois, people are like, wow. Even in February, even in March, 80 degrees, 80s for the whole week, like, wow, it's going to be in the 80s. Okay, in April, 80s also gets a little bit of a wow, but in April, the 90s. If it's in the 90s in April, that's like a wow for Chicago. Whenever temperatures are in the hundreds here in the Midwest, even in July, it's always like, wow, it's in the hundreds. And then when you go into the desert Southwest, the 110s gets a little bit of a wow, but really the 120s is what really gets like a wow, wow, wow when it's in the 120s. Okay, I know that was so anyways, and what about 130? 130 is already, the National Weather Service is already like, wow, but let's go check the thermometer to make sure it's accurate. So like the wow, it already loses the wow. The 120s, when you have people looking at it and meteorologists too, it's like, wow. 130, it's less of a wow, because the first thing that's done is the thermometer is taken in by the National Weather Service to check the accuracy of the thermometer. Like it can't be. So like this past year, for example, there was a Shabbos where the temperature on one thermometer hit 135 degrees in Death Valley, California. And a lot of people were standing there convinced that they were present for the official hottest temperature in history, which really only covers since 1870, and some records were uprooted, but the official highest temperature right now is 134 degrees, and that thermometer said 135, but the National Weather Service says in reality the high was 129 degrees. They say that thermometer was off. But 129 is still a wow. But once it's 130, it's let's check the thermometer. So what type of a wow do dew points get for those that are not familiar with dew points? So I could tell you, since I've been observing dew points for a very long time and have been interested in them, that like a dew point of 50 is not deserving of a wow. Usually a dew point of 50 is not deserving of any wow. A dew point of 57 would be like maybe upper 70s. Wow. If the temperature was in the upper 70s. So like if a temperature in the upper 70s is deserving of a wow. So like in December or January, if it's in the upper 70s, and so if you have a dew point of 57 in January or something, that's deserving of a wow. Or if you have a dew point of 57 in the desert Southwest, that gets a little bit of a wow. But a dew point of 60 is more like an 80-degree wow. That's like equivalent to like seeing 80s in Fairbanks, Alaska in the summertime, which it happens, but it's like cool, as in it's warm, it's swimming weather. A dew point of 60 degrees, that's officially humid. AccuWeather says a dew point of 57 already is considered slightly humid. But a temperature of 80 degrees here in the Midwest, if the high temperature was 80 degrees in the summertime, that would be like a joke. That's a cool air mass. That's certainly not a heat wave. So a dew point of 60 is deserving of a wow for many months of the year: January, December, February, March, perhaps even April. But for many months, it's not deserving of a wow. I would say when the dew point hits probably about 68 degrees or so, that would be like 90 degrees. That's sort of like, wow. The first time it hit 68, I would say. That's upper 60s. It's like, wow, it's in the upper 60s. It's like, wow, it's 90 degrees. Upper 60s anytime. December, January, February, March, April, May. You probably have to go a little bit higher than that. I would say a dew point of 72 would be like seeing a 95 degree reading on the weather map. It's like, wow, it's in the mid 90s. So the dew point is 72. That seems to be what the dew point is stuck at in St. Louis in the summertime, a lot of times during heat waves. Now, what would it be for it to be 100? So initially I was thinking 75. But no, 75 is like seeing a high in the upper 90s. It's like almost at 100. I would say a dew point of 76. That's like a wow. 77 already is like seeing a temperature of like 102 on the weather map. That's way up there. The temperature dew point of 77 would be like 102. A dew point of 78, that would be like seeing 105. Chicago had a dew point of 78 this past Thursday. So what type of reaction would that be? That would be like Chicago. Well, how would people react if it was 105 in Chicago? That's the hottest official reading in Chicago. The real hottest temperature in Chicago is 109. But during the year that 109 took place, the official reporting station was not at Midway, which it was at 109. It was on the lake where it was only 105. That was back in the 1930s. So then the dew point is 79 is like seeing 110 on that weather map. So notice how, by the way, in dew points, the more you go up, the more of a contrast there is between the intensity of how much warmer it makes you feel. So, which is a separate discussion, because every degree you go up past 75, it makes the temperature feel 2 degrees warmer than it actually is. Every degree you go up, every 3 degrees, 2 or 3 degrees you go up, and the dew point is 60, it makes the temperature feel 1 degree warmer than it actually is. So what 2 to 3 degrees accomplishes in the dew point area when it's in the 60s is less than what 1 degree accomplishes after 75. A dew point of 79, as pointed out in this podcast previously, is basically as high as it gets in this country. That's as high as it gets in this country. That means that, yeah, there are times where the dew points go above 79, but it's a rarity. It maybe happens once a year. It would be like the temperature hitting 100 in St. Louis. It happens every year just for a day or so. It doesn't happen every year, but just about every year for about a day or two, and that's it. So somewhere in this country, you'll probably find a dew point of 80 for a couple days in the summer, and that's about it. A dew point of 82 degrees, I think, is already like seeing 110 on the weather map. So the dew point last Thursday in Springfield was 81 degrees. 81 degrees. It's like almost there. It's like mind-boggling humidity. It's stuff that doesn't even occur on the Gulf Coast except maybe once every few years. And it's happening in Springfield. And then the dark sky weather map showed towns where it was at 83 degrees in Illinois. That's already past, that would be equivalent to seeing temperatures past 110 here. That's like the type of wow. That's already like at least making temperatures feel 24 degrees warmer than they actually are, perhaps even 27 degrees warmer than they actually are. And I would say a dew point of 86 or higher would be like seeing a 120 degree temperature on the weather map. That's just way up there. So on Friday, when that dew point was reported of 87 degrees, either on the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, that was like seeing 120s on a weather map. It's just like it's rare and it's very intense. I want to explain, after we got through that Nairischkeit, this part's not Nairischkeit. How does the dew point work? Well, the way the body cools itself off is called evaporative cooling. That's how it cools itself off. When you sweat, it's not the sweat that cools you off, it's the evaporation of the sweat. That means the quicker the evaporation could take place, the more efficient the body's air conditioning will be. The more efficient the natural air conditioning of the body will be. The quicker the sweat evaporates. The more humid it is, the slower that sweat evaporates. Therefore, the body loses part of its mechanism to cool itself off. So things become very dangerous when dew points start getting above. Things are extremely uncomfortable when dew points are like 72 or higher, but when dew points are above 77 or so, 77 or higher, or maybe 78 or higher, it's beyond just uncomfortable. It's really dangerous. The body really barely has any mechanism at all to cool itself off. The effects of humidity intensify as the temperature gets warmer. So if the temperature is 80 degrees and the dew point's 80, I don't know what the heat index would be, but it could be the heat index would only be something like 96. The temperature feels 16 degrees warmer than it actually is. But if the temperature would be 90 and the dew point 80, the temperature would feel 20 degrees warmer than it actually is. And if the temperature was 100 and the dew point was 80, the temperatures would feel even more than 20 degrees warmer than they actually are. The definition of the dew point is the temperature at which the conditions become saturated, the temperature at which the environment would be holding 100% relative humidity. Relative humidity is relative. It's humidity that's relative. The warmer the air temperature, the more water moisture it can hold because heat expands. So just like a large jar could hold more water than a small jar, so hot air could hold more water than cold air. So when the temperature is 90 degrees and the relative humidity is 50%, that is holding the exact amount of water that 70 degrees is holding with 100% relative humidity. If it's 70 degrees and there's 100% relative humidity, and then suddenly the temperature would rise to 90, the relative humidity would drop to 50%, and the dew point would be 70 degrees. That's how it works. So if the temperature can never be lower than the dew point, and when the temperatures are under 60, it can never be humid. There will be a moist feeling, I've noticed, if the relative humidity is high. So relative humidity has some significance, and I think when dew points are in the 60s, and the relative humidity, I think, plays a role when you're dealing with dew points in the 60s. I think when you have high relative humidity, plus the dew points are in the 60s, so temperatures are also like near 70, you feel the humidity. Whereas if it's in the 90s and dew points are in the 60s, especially in the hundreds and dew points are in the 60s, sometimes it feels most like a dry heat almost. Yet there still might be a little bit of a heat index. So the relative humidity plays a role, I think, in terms of how it feels sometimes in borderline situations, the relative humidity will play a role in how it feels. But once it's really humid, dew points are in the 70s, it's going to feel humid no matter what the relative humidity is. Even if the relative humidity is under 50%, it's still going to feel humid. Okay, we have increased this. It was really a 10-minute dew point discussion, and it has now become a 25-minute dew point discussion. But there's one more thing that I was thinking of that I wanted to point out, that I've noticed that the dew points on the coast are always, the highest dew points on the coast are always, when I say always, I think about 95% of the time, maybe 100% of the time, are about 10 degrees lower than the water temperatures. So, and the Gulf of Mexico has solid water temperatures. It's not like Lake Michigan where it's 80 degrees on the Chicago shoreline and mid-60s out in the middle of the lake. which I think the newspaper had it wrong the other day when it said it was 80 in the middle of the lake and 60s on the shoreline. I think they might have had it wrong. Maybe they didn't. But usually it could be warmer on the shoreline, mid-60s out in the lake. So if you have winds coming in off Lake Michigan, maybe Lake Michigan I would think could certainly produce dew points in the 50s. That might be as high as it can get. Maybe winds off of Lake Michigan could get dew points in the 60s in the month of August. That is possible. But the real humidity, when it gets humid here in Chicago, it's not because winds are off the lake. It's because winds are off of the Gulf of Mexico. I know it's 1,000 miles away, but that doesn't matter. And when you have the humidity coming in off the Gulf of Mexico, going over all the Midwest vegetation, that maintains the dew points, and then when it reaches the cornfields in Iowa, by the time it gets to Iowa, a lot of times those dew points start to go up. What's the reason why the dew points by a cornfield are going to be higher than dew points on the Gulf Coast? So it's very simple. But it's a chap. It's something people never would have thought of in a million years, and until they observe it. You would think if you're by a body of very, very warm water, that's going to be where the highest dew points are. But then when you take a look at the weather map and you see during intense heat waves, only during intense heat waves, the highest the 80-degree dew points are not on the Gulf. You won't find 80-degree dew points on the Gulf except for maybe once a year. If there are to be 80-degree dew points in this country, they will be occurring in Iowa, on the cornfields. Or we have to add Illinois. I drive to St. Louis, it's all cornfields. So Illinois also, and that's what happened on Thursday. We have dew points low to mid-80s in Missouri, in Iowa, even in southeast Nebraska. There might have even been some bordering states south of Illinois and Missouri, a little tiny area there, perhaps, that had dew points near 80. So that's where you're going to see those dew points of 80. Why? And the reason is because the temperature can never be lower than the dew point. So, therefore, the temperatures are never going to be warmer than the water. The air coming in off of water temperature, off of the ocean, that air temperature is going to be about what the water temperature is. So the air coming in off the Gulf of Mexico is going to be about 88 degrees or so. Okay, I don't know why the dew points are not 88. I thought of a theory, maybe because the humid air is actually lighter than drier air. It's the opposite of what you would think. So the humid air rises. So it could be the dew points are 88, but that air goes above. So the surface air has dew points of 78. It's about 10 degrees lower. Occasionally, the Gulf of Mexico has some 90-degree water temperatures. That's when you'll see an 80-degree dew point. But generally, it's in the upper 80s. So the dew points remain in the upper 70s. When you get to the but one thing for sure is the dew points would never go higher than the upper 80s or 90. They're usually in the upper 70s. When you get to the cornfields, there is no limit. There's no limit because the cornfields get as hot as the air temperature is. So, and they're producing tons and tons of moisture. Because remember, you could have 1 billion miles of water. But only the top layer is going to be evaporating. In terms of how much moisture is being produced into the environment, it doesn't matter how deep that water is. It could be the cornfield is producing the same amount of moisture. It's not, but it is producing massive amounts. I forgot exactly how much it was. I had a previous podcast on this. But the ocean does produce more evaporation, but the cornfields do produce enormous evaporation of water. So therefore, dew points are higher on the cornfields. But you do need air from the Gulf of Mexico to start it off. We're never going to hit 70 degree dew points without air off the Gulf of Mexico. The vegetation here in the Midwest could probably get dew points perhaps up to 60, and those cornfields could probably increase it into the mid, maybe even upper 60s, but not 70. But when you have those 70 degree dew points, or by late summer, by now mid-July onward, or late July, dew points coming in off the Gulf, 75 degrees or even higher, and those dew points are maintaining because of the vegetation. They're maintaining mid and upper 70s. When that goes over the cornfields, so then that's when you get those dew points in the mid 80s. All right, this has been 31 minutes. I wish everybody a great... Let's just say one more thing, okay? The area in the world which has the highest dew points is the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. The reason for that is because the water temperatures in the Persian Gulf are warmer than the Gulf of Mexico by at least 5 degrees, sometimes even more. So they're generally closer to 93 degrees. They're generally in the low 90s, but mid 90s, sometimes it's been in the upper 90s. So if water temperatures are in the 90s, the dew points on the coast to there are going to be, again, 10 degrees lower than the water temperatures. So dew points are going to be in the 80s. The one place besides the Midwest Corn Belt where you have dew points in the 80s, despite the fact it's not on any water, is central India. That's because of the monsoon season, which maybe we'll discuss some other time. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a wonderful day.